We're going to pick up in verse 18 to begin with, and we will read through chapter 2, verse 5 to start with. Galatians 1:18. Then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. But others of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother. Now the things which I write to you, behold, before God I lie not. Afterward I came into the regions of Syria and Cilicia, and was unknown by face unto the churches of Judea which were in Christ. But they had heard only that he which persecuted us in times past now preacheth the faith which once he destroyed, and they glorified God in me. Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem to Barnabas, and took Titus with me also. And I went up by revelation, and communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them who were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised, and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privately to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage, to whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you.
After 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to learn from Kepha, and remained with him for 15 days. And I saw no other of the emissaries except Jacob, the brother of the master. What I write to you, see, before Elohim, I do not lie. Then I went into the districts of Syria and Cilicia, and I was still not known by sight to the assemblies of Yehuda, which were in Messiah, but they were hearing only that the one who once persecuted us brings as good news the belief which he once ravaged. So they were esteeming Elohim in me. Then after 14 years I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along too. And I went up by revelation, and I laid before them that good news, which I proclaim among the nations, but separately to those who were esteemed, lest somehow I run or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. For as for the false brothers sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Messiah Yahusha, in order to enslave us, to these we did not yield in subjection, not even for an hour, so that the truth of the good news remains with you. So what we have here, I think it's necessary for us to tie these two chapters together in this way, because it's contextually Shaul just giving us the background, and it can be read. You can read, his, for example, what he refers to in verse 18 of chapter 1, in Acts chapter 9, when he went up to Jerusalem, that they were coming and going, and that there was conversation going on there. And it appears, even by the reading in Acts, that some were still questioning about Shaul, about the validity of his conversion. And now he's referring to, in this book of Galatians, some skepticism about some of those who are false brothers who had snuck in. So there was that kind of contentious kind of intrigue going on early on, and we can see that in the readings there. And so Shaul, not wanting to disrespect these men because they were emissaries, but also not to overly respect them, almost deify them.
Right.
He wants to know what they believe and compare that to what he was believing. We see also in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 10, as a result of this early conversation in Acts chapter 9 with Shaul and some of the others, Kepha now in school. And Yahweh is teaching him that he still has a lot of false traditional beliefs in his personal theology. Even though he spent 3.5 years face-to-face with Messiah Yahusha, he still need to be deprogrammed. And that is a process, and it takes time. And depending on the diligence of the person that is being deprogrammed of their, or maybe debugged,
right,
would be a better way to put it, because it was false doctrine that had hampered Kepha. And you can read about that in Acts chapter 10 when Kepha has a vision. It has nothing to do with food. We've already done a couple of sessions on that chapter. It was simply the commitment to the Torah of Yahweh, will that prevail in Kepha's life and his belief system, or will it not?
Right.
Yahweh never calls people unclean. Mm-hmm. Now, their practices might make them unclean. Mm-hmm. What happens to them, maybe even physically, might cause them to be considered unclean. But people are not inherently unclean, and that was not what was being taught in traditional Judaism of the time that we see, I believe, the instruction that Yahweh is giving Kepha in Acts chapter 10. So Shaul, goes and converses with Kepha. And, what did you learn from that? What was the outcome of that? Well, if you look at Kepha's own commentary on his own vision, instead of allowing your pastor or yourself or anybody else put words in Peter's mouth that Peter never spoke, it has nothing to do with food. It was that he was still calling people who were not Jewish or not of Israel unclean, because that was the traditional thought.
Well, not to overly compare ourselves with these men, Kepha or Shaul, Peter or Paul, there are things that we can gather from that. They were going through a deprogramming or a debugging process based on the traditions they were in. It's the same thing with us. Just because we might have spent many years in, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, Christianity, doesn't mean that we've got it all together and right. We have a lot of things, a lot of baggage that we picked up that we have to shed along the way to come to the knowledge of the truth, apart from all of that leaven of lies and traditions that have nothing to do with what Yah said.
Agreed. Ephesians 4, for example, will give a good commentary on what you just described. And Shaul, because he's been going through that when he writes the letter to the Ephesians, it's a process of elimination of that which is not good, and then the addition of that, or the accumulation of that which is good, and that would be the truth of Yah, that will bring us to a perfect man, where we won't be tossed to and fro by the scheming of man that is lying in wait to deceive. So there again is a reference that Shaul makes in Ephesians 4, very similar to what he's referring to here in Galatians 2. Traditional Christianity, I taught this for over 20 years in traditional Christianity, and I taught it wrong. It was absolutely not contextually, not historically sound. But it was the acceptable teaching that is being propagated today among most, if not all, traditional Christian churches regarding Galatians. And that is that this letter is Shaul's letter of repentance, that we are, as Christians now, not to have anything to do with the law, anything to do with anything that is required, for example, circumcision, anything to do with anything that happened prior to Messiah coming here in the flesh, and the four versions of his life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection, as we read them in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That is in error. And so I realize that now, and so just like I'm trying not to put words in Peter's mouth in Acts chapter 10, let me encourage you as a listener not to put words in Shaul's or Paul's mouth as you read the book of Galatians.
Amen. When I was taking Bible college classes, the Bible college teacher that covered this letter to the Galatians, he called this, and he titled his lesson in it, that this was the Christian's declaration of independence from the law.
Wow.
And you consider that, the word independence. And interestingly enough, we're recording this on the United States of America's Independence Day.
Yep.
Independent, when you really think about that, independent from what? Independent of the law.
Which is the word of Yahweh.
Yes. If we're not dependent upon His word and what His instruction,
then we are independent.
Yeah. We've not only separated ourselves from those instructions, but we've separated ourselves from the protection, the provision, and all the blessing that comes through being dependent upon Him.
Deuteronomy 28. Every other prophet calling the people of Yah who thought the way today's traditionalism thinks, and that is we can live independent from the law of Yahweh. Every prophet was called in what people would refer to as the Old Testament prophets, the major and the minor, They never considered themselves either one, but we do, and so that's what we call them, and that's ridiculous. But nevertheless, their message was consistently to call the covenant people who profess to believe and follow the creator of the universe, Yahweh is his name, back to repentance.
Amen.
Back to what Yahweh has said in the beginning.
Amen.
And from the beginning. And so that's what Shaul is continuing here. Now, how does that pertain to these different visitations? Like I referred one visitation here in Acts chapter 9. There's another one that's referred to in Galatians 2, verse 1, 14 years after that. Mm-hmm. I think that can be referenced in Acts chapter 11, when he was commissioned to go by their hands, take this to the brothers in Jerusalem, and Barnabas and Titus are included in that ministry. And it says in verse 2 of Galatians 2 that Shaul says he went up by revelation. In other words, he wanted to talk with these once again to make sure that he was on the same page or they were on the same page. And it's by revelation. Now that is very, I believe, in contrast to his commissioning previous, before he even knew Messiah, by the Sanhedrin. Mm-hmm. He was commissioned by dictate, by a Sanhedrin who commissioned him to persecute those who were following the true Messiah according to the truth that he propagated, and not according to their truth, which was not truth at all. And so Shaul is saying that he went up by revelation, and he laid before them the good news, and separately to those who were esteemed, he wanted to make sure specifically, you guys, we're on the same page here, right? You guys are teaching this, okay, I'm teaching this. Even though we have different audiences, Kepha to the circumcised, that would be to those in Judah. Shaul tried to go to the circumcised. They would not receive him. They persecuted him. They chased him. They condemned him. They accused him. And so he realized that at a point in the book of Acts, you can read about it, I no longer will try to go to you. I will go to where I'm called, and that is to the nations, to the Gentiles, Amen. To those who had never heard or understood the truth of Torah, but had only been able to come in contact with it occasionally, and also specifically through the lives of those who were not living it, who were not walking in that truth, but were walking in their own traditions.
I mean, that message that Shaul had taken to the circumcised, and now, as you just alluded to, that he no longer would go to them, but would go to the uncircumcised. That's been taught that it's a different message to the uncircumcised than it is to the circumcised.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and the reality of that is back up in chapter 1, where he talks about verse 15, when it pleased Elohim, separated me from my mother's womb, called me by his favor to reveal his son to me, that I might bring him the good news to the nations. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, neither did I go up to Jerusalem. And he talks about this revelation of Messiah Yahusha that is in opposition to what he had progressed in verse 14 in Yehudaism. So when he goes to these, he's wanting to find out, are you still devoted to Yehudaism?
Right.
Or are you devoted to Messiah? Has he been revealed in you?
That's it.
That's the page.
Yeah, so the revelation that Shaul would refer to is, as the set-apart Spirit reveals to him the truth that he had been taught from a child, from the age of a child. He now is in the process, even as you and I are, and hopefully the listeners are, of sorting out, according to measuring everything by the word of Yah, what is truth, what is not truth.
Amen.
So when he gets to the place of saying in verse 3, but not even Titus, who was with me, though a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Why would he make an issue of that? Well, some say, traditionalism says, see right there, he's cutting everybody free from the law. There's no reason to fulfill any of the law. Well, you have to consider a couple things. The first circumcision, who was it, and what was the reason for that circumcision?
Yeah, well, at that time it was because of unbelief on Abraham's part, because he struggled believing the promise that Yah would give him a son.
Okay. So we see the first reference to circumcision as regarding Abraham, after he had listened to his wife and tried to fulfill in the flesh, at the beckoning of his wife Sarah, with the handmaid Hagar, an Egyptian, I believe, that in the flesh, trying to fulfill the promise that Yahweh had given him that he'd have a son, because they didn't want to wait. After that episode is when we see circumcision instituted. Even prior to that episode, Abraham, because he believed Yahweh, was counted righteous.
Amen.
And I believe it's in Genesis 26, verses 4 and 5, testimony and a commentary on the life of Abraham, that he obeyed Yah's laws, his statutes, his ordinance, his commands.
Yeah, and actually the word there is Torah.
Torah. So Abraham knew the commandments. He believed Yah. And because he believed Yah, even prior to circumcision, he was counted as one that was righteous, right standing with the Creator of the universe. After disobedience, his disobedience with Hagar, comes circumcision. You see the same sequencing of things in the giving of Torah, in the Torah that was meant for fellowship, just like a marriage. There are the vows that are exchanged between the husband and the wife, and as long as both husband and wife keep those vows, the marriage remains intact. You don't change the vows 10 years down the road in the marriage. Well, let's include, this, or let's stop being faithful to each other, or let's, the marriage doesn't continue in a covenant relationship. So you see that same progression in the relationship between Yahweh and his people, who said to him when they were given his Torah, his instruction, all he says we will do. That was the response, almost like a bride to a groom. The groom utters the vows, this is what I require, and Israel says, all he says, all you say, we will do, almost like I will in the vows of a marriage. Then comes the golden calf. After the golden calf episode, we have commandments aplenty. And the people abandon much of what is required in this covenant relationship, but are still required to live by these commandments. Now, what I've just described is what I described earlier in the description of a wedding or a marriage that has gone off track because one or both have broken the vows. For example, the vows unite the two people as long as they keep them. They are not under the bondage of the law of the land. But if either of them break the vows that they uttered in a marriage ceremony that was heard by all the witnesses and testified on the license, if either of them break those vows and then pursue divorce, who do they come under? Who is the jurisdiction that they come under? It's the judge.
Amen. It's the law, because they broke the law of the marriage, the law of the husband. Therefore, they come under the penalty of that law. It has to be judged in that manner.
It's a very important illustration to keep in mind as you're looking at what Shaul is speaking here.
Amen.
So the reason Titus was not compelled to be circumcised was because circumcision was not required of him. He was already circumcised in the heart, believing in the Master Yahushua Messiah.
Amen.
In the mind of Judaism of that time, they still required, even if you profess to believe in the Messiah, because many of them did profess to believe in the Messiah, Yahushua Messiah, they still compelled people who were never circumcised to become circumcised so you can, in their minds, be more saved. That's what Shaul is saying. You can't be more saved.
Right.
You're either circumcised in the heart and you walk according to the covenant, the book of the covenant, which includes all the commands of Yahweh, from the perspective of obedience, or you reject the law of Yahweh and you find yourself under the jurisdiction of the book of the law.
So it comes down to who is doing the circumcising. If it's a man doing the circumcising, then you're entering into a covenant with the man.
In this case, with the Judah.
Yeah, so that is the Yehudism or the Judaism that Shaul talks about back in chapter 1 of Galatians.
That's exactly right.
So entering into that relationship, they're saying that the only way you can complete this deal, it's all right if you believe in Messiah Yahushua, but you can't complete this deal unless you go through this rite of circumcision and come in through us and be a part of us.
Yeah, now listen to what Shaul says in Romans chapter 2. For circumcision indeed, in verse 25, profits if you practice the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
So circumcision isn't going to save you any more than water baptism would save you if you don't believe in your heart.
Amen.
Okay. But if you are a transgressor of Torah, of the instruction of Yahweh, your circumcision has become like uncircumcision, has become uncircumcision. So, if an uncircumcised one watches over the righteousness of Torah, shall not his uncircumcised circumcision be reckoned as circumcision? So if a person who has not been raised in Judaism, has not been circumcised, but hears and believes the word of Yahweh, and obeys it in righteous belief, then they have become the true circumcised.
Yeah, by the hands of Yahweh.
And that's what he says. And the uncircumcised by nature who perfects the Torah shall judge you, who notwithstanding letter and circumcision are a transgressor of Torah. For he is not a Jew, a Yahudi, who is so outwardly. Neither is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. But a Jew or a Yahudi is he who is so inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in spirit, capital S, not literally, whose praise is not from men, but from Elohim.
Amen.
So that's what Shaul is referring to here. Because Titus had been circumcised in the heart, and his lifestyle proved that he obeyed Yahweh by obeying his commands, then there's no need for him to be circumcised outwardly by men because of what men's requirements had been given to them because of unbelief and disobedience. Titus was being obedient.
Amen.
And that's why he was not circumcised. And that's why Shaul describes these people as false brothers in verse 4, sneakingly brought in, who sneaked in to spy out our freedom which we have in Messiah Yahushua in order to enslave us, in order to make us a part of their sect, a part of their criteria for salvation. For example, someone believes, and they believe from the heart, and they're born of the Spirit. And a cult comes along, a cult that practices some of what is written in the Scriptures, but they add to it, and they subtract from it. And they get to this brother who believes in the heart, wants to follow Yahweh, put their arm around him, and they lead him into their rites, into their rituals, into their processes that they have ordained. That's exactly what Shaul is saying. They sneak in, they ensnare you, they get you to the place of questioning your salvation, to the place that you think, well, maybe I really should be circumcised and become a part of Judaism,
right,
so that I am for sure in the boat when the final tally is made. That's what Shaul is addressing here.
Amen. So it becomes a misplaced faith.
A misplaced faith is exactly, and that's why he says in verse 5, to these false brothers who snuck in to spy out. Now some would interpret their freedom as freedom from the law.
No, just the opposite.
Again, when you're living by the law of the land and you're not breaking it, you're enjoying freedom.
Absolutely.
When you break the law of the land, you lose your freedom.
Yeah, that's when the jailer comes along.
They put you in the cage.
Yeah.
So please understand that example is just an expression of Yah and his faithfulness to cause men and women to realize what is right and true.
Amen. You know, the witness, Yahusha's witness in Matthew chapter 23, beginning in verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go about the land and the sea to win one convert, and when he is won, you make him a son of Gehenna or hell, twofold more than yourselves.
Yeah.
So that's the what he's talking about in Yehudism. These people, these scribes, these Pharisees, these hypocrites, were the ones who commissioned Shaul on his first mission that persecuted the believers.
That's exactly why I pointed out the comparison. When Shaul, by the set-apart Spirit of Yahweh, goes up to Yerushalayim by revelation, it's not by commission of some man.
Amen.
It's by revelation and being led by the Spirit of Yah to accomplish that in the Spirit that man cannot accomplish because he's too busy trying to accomplish things in the flesh.
Amen.